Hello and welcome to the last chapter on the Catalan. Till now, we have covered the main lines as well as the side lines, pretty much after short castle and short castle. In this chapter, we'll be covering all of White's Catalan sidelines arising from this position and some sidelines before this position. Let's go back. Our first sideline starts from third G3, which is a very respectable alternate way to reach the Catalan positions. However, simply because of our repertoire, we don't have to check anything else, and we can simply transpose with knight f6, bishop g2, and bishop e7. If white plays knight f3, we transpose back to our repertoire. And if white plays knight c3, we'll still play short castle, where white has nothing else but to transpose back to the repertoire with knight f3. That is another added advantage of playing knight f6 and bishop e7, where we don't have to be worried about white's some sideline tries, simply because the moves knight f6, bishop e7, and short castle are constant in our repertoire, so we'll not be bothered about some move order tries from white. On the third move, after knight f3, knight f6, g3, we reach the Catalan. We play bishop e7. And here white has some choices apart from bishop g2, which is the main line by far. There is queen c2. There is knight c3. Then there is queen b3. And finally, bishop g2. So let's start with bishop queen c2 first. I'm sorry, we'll come to bishop g2 at the end since it's the main line. Queen c2, short castle, and white has two independent tries here apart from bishop g2, which is a very big main line and the main line of this chapter as well. White has bishop f4 and white has knight bd2. Both of them, they are not really serious tries, but has been tried by some grandmasters here and there. So we'll just have a brief look about these moves. Coming to this position, let's start with bishop f4. We may also reach this position with 5 bishop f4, short castle, and queen c2. I'll be covering this position from the queen c2, castle, bishop f4 move order. Now, what's white's idea of playing bishop f4 and delaying bishop g2? So white has more space, right? And white is slightly behind in development, rather lagging in development. And with bishop f4, white's idea is that unlike the main line with bishop g2 here, where we had c5, bc5, and d4, where we were trying for knight c6 and e5, gaining space in the center, here we won't have that try, right? Sorry, bishop f4. Yeah, if we try to go for that same idea here, maybe with d4 first, white has the e5 square under control. That is white's point. But what's the drawback of this move? It's obvious that white's king is still in the center, so playing bishop f4 might turn out to be slightly risky since your king's in the center and you are not really trying to castle. What do? We can stay thematic to our plan and undermine white's center with c5. The alternate line here is knight a6 with the idea of preparing c5, and this is computer's top choice. It makes more sense because after c5, dc5, we can't play bishop into c5 due to c into d5, and this bishop on c5 being hanging, we can't recapture with the knight. But after knight a6 here, we can actually take back with the bishop. So why is that if it's the top choice of the engine? I don't recommend you to play knight a6. Well, it's because it's not part of our plan in most of the variations. It's much easier for you to be consistent and remember c5 rather than remembering knight a6 just for one odd sideline, right? What happens here is then you'll try to mix it up in two different positions. You'll have the idea of playing knight a6 somewhere, you'll have the idea of playing c5 somewhere, and you'll not be sure when to choose the right option. To avoid all this confusion, I try to be as consistent as I can and play c5 if it works. In this position, it works. So we'll play c5. D into c5. Yeah, just a small point to add. C into d5 is not great because of knight into d5. And the point, in fact, we can even play c d4. My point here was with knight d5 that after dc5, knight f4, gf4, we have multiple ways to win back this pawn, and white will have a spoiled pawn structure along with the loss of pair of bishops. But computer in fact prefers c into d4 with the simple idea that d into e6 runs into bishop into e6. We have more space. White's king is in the center, so white is busted. Knight c6 is coming, knight b4 is coming, rook c8 is coming. We'll use our pieces and exploit white's lack of development. D into c5. So what's white's point here? White wants to force us to play bishop c5, where they will have some ideas with bishop g2 and c into d5. Bishop on c5 is a bit vulnerable, which white will try to exploit. What do we do here? As usual, I want to be consistent, and what do I do? d4. Just the same plan as the main line. What is the main line? Bishop g2. And here we'll have the same plan, c5, dc5, d4. We'll again try to play knight c6 and e5. If white tries to stop us with bishop f4, what we are checking basically, we'll play d4, bishop g2, we'll play knight c6, short castle, and white claims that, hey, you can't play e5. All right, I'll prepare it. Knight d7. I want to play e5 next, and then I want to play knight into c5, where I'll be much better due to the space in the center. My pawns on e5 and d4 are dominating the center, and then my knights on c5 and c6 are very well placed too. So if I have a combination of piece activity and space in my favor, I'll be clearly better. The only way white can keep the balance here is by trading with bishop d6, but this is a chicken move. We are not afraid. And after knight c5, bishop e7, queen into e7, followed by e5, we keep a very minute edge, and I would pick black 10 times out of 10 in this position. What is our idea? We want to play e5, gain space. We may even try to play e4 if it's possible. Otherwise, we'll just develop our pieces with bishop g4, get the rooks into the center, and then try to roll our pawns. White might try to play somewhat on the queen side with b4, specifically with queen d2. But okay, we'll play e5, and if white doesn't play b4, we'll start rolling the pawns with rook d8. If white plays b4, knight e4, queen c2, white is attacking the knight so that we can't recapture the pawn. But we'll come back with the knight, and white basically is on a very thin rope here. Some with b5, white is probably fine, but we'll play knight d8, try to get a knight to this juicy outpost, put our pieces on good squares, bishop coming in, and then if possible, get the rooks in and push the pawn in the center. Our idea is clear. We want to gain more space and squeeze white in this position. Coming back. So this variation with bishop f4 is not really threatening. The other line here is knight bd2. And white's point is that firstly dc4 can be met with knight c4. And the other point is that c5, d into c5 runs bishop into c5. Again, white might try to have some knight b3 ideas somewhere, although it's not really strong. And instead of, we'll still play c5, challenge white's center, try to undermine it. And after dc5, we can avoid bishop c5 for a move and just play knight c6. Our ideas stay clear. We want to play d4 and e5 and then take on c5. If white plays c into d5, now we happily take back with which piece? The pawn, the knight or queen? Well, with the queen, because you want to attack the pawn on c5. Bishop g2, e5. You'll have more space in the center. The bishop's coming in. And once we recapture, black stands better due to more activity and the space in the center. That brings us an end to this sideline with queen c2. We obviously have to check the main line with short castle bishop g2, but the other sidelines are not so threatening. Let's go back. There is 5 knight c3, but after knight bd7, we transpose back to a chapter in the Manhattan system. To give you an idea, we may land in the same position with knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, knight bd7, g3, and bishop e7. So if we can go back and check this chapter out for g3, bishop e7, the other sideline is queen b3, which may also arise from bishop g2, castle, and queen b3. Let's check it via this move order, although that move order is perfectly fine as well. Short castle and bishop g2. So what is it that forced white to play queen b3 instead of short castle? Well, white's idea is that, of course, after dc4, white wants to play queen c4 and keep more space in the center. White is not giving up the pawn for free. The drawback, the queen is clearly vulnerable here and white's king is still in the center. What have we decided? What to do when your opponent's king is in the center? Strike the center, open it up. How? c5, our typical idea. There is c6, which is also very much possible. The idea is to play b6, bishop a6, and knight bd7 in some way. It's a very good plan, but it goes against the kind of positions we are already checking out. So I want it to be as consistent as I can. But let's say if you're playing a lower rated player where you don't want to trade many pieces, you can check this out. I still want to be consistent and play c5. Yeah. And white has mainly two choices here. There's short castle and there is c into d5. By the way, dc5 is not good because now the queen is on b3. So rather than taking with the bishop, I get a new piece out, knight a6, and I want to take with the knight, attacking the queen, and then play b6, bishop b7, finish my development. Of course, if we are able to develop comfortably, we'll have a very good position because we have 3 minor pieces developed. White doesn't have a space advantage anymore, and if these pawns are traded, we'll have basically the complete control of the center, giving us a small but a reliable edge. After c5, so the main move is short castle. The main move is c into d5, pardon me, but there is short castle as well. What do we do here? Simple, knight c6, get a new piece into the game, attack the pawns. dc5, how do we respond to this? With the typical d4, gaining space and threatening knight d7, knight c5. This knight on f6, it's not so great, but on c5, it's much better. Why? Because we can roll our pawns. Right? From f6, it obstructs the pawns. On c5, it assists those pawns. And with the queen on b3, you'll have an additional tempo with knight into c5. So white can't do that. What can white do? C into d5. And here we'll have to be realistic and play queen d5, not creating many weaknesses in our position. The problem with knight into d5 is that after dc5, bishop c5, rook d1, with the idea of e4, white has a very small edge. And with ed5, we would have an isolated pawn with not enough compensation, in my opinion. After dc5, bishop c5, well, we may be fine objectively, but I think white's position is much easier to handle. We need to be realistic and trade the queens to avoid weaknesses in our position. And well, okay, if white wants to make a draw in this way, we can't help it. And we'll see if we can win. But you'll have, as black, sometimes you just have to have some concessions and have a simple draw. White's main move is d into c5. By the way, queen d5 is not good because as we have discussed earlier, this helps black to get a piece into the center with knight d5. Any exchange which helps the opponent's piece to improve is usually not so great. dc5 and bishop into c5. Now black has three pieces in the center while white doesn't have a piece in the center. These pieces are yet to be developed. We have a very small lead in development. Of course, the position's equal, but maybe we can try to fight for something here. Also, note that the pawns are easier to roll here. White can't play e4 easily because of knight b4, while f6, e5 gaining some space is still pretty much possible. And if we are able to do that, we'll have a small edge due to the extra space in the center. We'll also be neutralizing this bishop on c1, so white will have some issues with the dark square bishop as well. However, bc5 is very good. Now the problem with bishop c5 uh, is that knight c3, bishop c5 runs into knight c3, and so we can play queen into b3, create weaknesses in white's queen side, a into b3, bishop into c5, and we have an imbalanced position. On one hand, white has a poor pawn structure, which is in our favor, but on the other hand, white has clear active pieces, right? So activity is maybe the second most important element in my opinion, followed, of course, king safety comes first, although it's very much close to material. But pawn structure is probably the fourth element after activity, material, king safety, and then we come to pawn structure. So in that sense, white is not so worse. In fact, white's completely fine. But the issue for white is activity can be neutralized if we are able to develop our pieces comfortably. Pawn structure cannot be repaired easily. So in this position, let's just see the moves after knight c3. The point which I'm trying to convey here is that if we are able to develop our pieces comfortably, we'll have a slight edge. But white, what will white try to do? White will try to keep on improving their pieces and somehow to stop us from developing comfortably. Now, what's the biggest problem for us in this position? Probably the bishop on c8, right? It doesn't have so many good squares. If you play bishop d7, trying to develop it, white will have some pressure after bishop f4, followed by ideas of knight e5, where this will be under pressure, or rook fd1, where this square and the bishop on d7 will be under pressure. So how do we solve the problem of bishop c8? By playing e5. We gain space, stop bishop f4, and now prepare bishop f5 or bishop g4, where the bishop is very well placed. If white is not able to stop us from developing comfortably, we'll have a better position thanks to the better pawn structure. White has some chances with knight a4, where white holds comfortably, but the position is still imbalanced enough, and all you need to focus on is to getting your pieces out at the right time, and then trying to attack white's weakness on b3 and e2. Keep in mind that you have more space in the center, and you are very happy playing an endgame because of the spoiled white's pawn structure. Coming back, so this brings us an end to the sideline with queen b3, and we basically reach the main line with bishop g2 castle, and this we reach an important crossroads where white has some sidelines. The main move here is queen c2, which is pretty much the second most important sideline in the Catalan, but also something like queen d3, b3, knight bd2, bishop f4, and some sidelines with knight c3 and queen b3, which we have already checked. Let's start with the very rare sideline, queen d3. This has been played by Fabiano, and the point is very similar to queen c2, where white wants to meet dc4 with queen c4 and keep an a small space advantage. What's the issue with queen d3? Well, on one hand, it's not vulnerable to some knight jumps, but on the other hand, after b6, it's vulnerable to the bishop, right? After bishop a6, the pin is very annoying. We can try playing c5 here, but there is a slight issue because of short castle. And unlike the variation with queen c2, where we play c5, here the issue is after c d4, this pawn is very comfortably guarded. So it doesn't bring that kind of effect. What we are trying to do here is exploit white's poor positioning of the queen. The drawback of queen d3 is of course that after b6, bishop a6, the queen will be under pin, and thus it's one of the very rare moments where I'm recommending something which we don't play usually. However, playing b6 is extremely natural, and thus I don't think it would be very hard for you to memorize it, and therefore I recommend it as the main move. If you're not comfortable, you can still play c5, not an issue. b6, c into d5. Alright, so what's the point of c d5? Well, after short castle, we had bishop a6, pinning the pawn, and after b3, we'll play c5, now strike the center, and we don't have to be worried about any pawn captures. Our idea is very simple, play knight c6 and start harassing those pawns. With knight a5 or cd4, rook c8, all we have to do is just put pressure on the central pawns. So cd5, and now what do? We can take back with the pawn, we can take back with the knight, or we can take back with the queen. Which one will you choose and why? Well, if you chose knight into d5, congratulations, it's the strongest move. It's very important to note that playing ed5 is not so great when you have committed b6. Why so? Let me just show you a typical QGD position. And this is a very important theme from QGD as well. Let's say bishop g5, h6 castle, e3, and b6. Now after cd5, if you play ed5, the point is when you play, okay, to give you a better idea, let's say white plays cd5 here. Now the point is after ed5, your plan is to play c6, get the bishop out to f5 or g4, and then play knight bd7. However, if you play b6, now you cannot push c6 and guard this pawn because the pawn is on b6 and this will be weak. That's the very critical difference between playing e into d5 and knight d5 when you have committed b6, right? So if you put your bishop on b7, then it becomes a bad bishop. That's why here after bishop g2 castle, queen d3, b6, cd5, we want to play knight d5 and not e d5, where we'll have issues with our bishop and the pawn on c7. So knight into d5. Now we have less space. What should be our automatic reaction next? To play bishop a6, challenge the queen, develop a piece, and then pushing c5, challenging white's central pawn. If we are able to exchange it, we won't have issues because we have center control and a great bishop on a6. Castle. We are following Ding versus Anish, and Anish played bishop a6 followed by c5. The position was very comfortable and Anish went on to win the game. Let's go back. Another interesting try here is to play b3, trying to maintain pawns in the center. This has been played by some top level players, but the drawback is obvious that after dc4, b into c4, you have a set of hanging pawns. How do we exploit that? By playing c5, gaining space, and at the same time challenging opponent's center. Castle. What do? We are not yet developed, so knight c6. Keep in mind that cd4 is a bit hasty here because you're allowing white to improve the position of the knight with knight d4. The knight's great in the center and the bishop's open too. Why to do that? Play knight c6. Ask white to take so that your bishop is now improved. White won't do that obviously and play e3, trying to maintain tension. A good characteristic of a strong player is to maintain the tension and not release it in unfavorable terms just because it's difficult to calculate. If you are trying to become a strong player, you have to do the hard things and just not let tension pass by because it's difficult to calculate, right? You also need to keep in mind that your opponent's in trouble with the tension too. Your opponent has to calculate as well. Chess is a complex game, so trying for simplicity all the time is probably not the best response. Now with e3, white wants to play bishop b2, knight d2 next, and then claim a small space advantage due to the extra pawns in the center. What do we do? Well, we know that this pawn on c4 is a weakness, and how do we go about it? By playing knight a5. We start attacking the weakness, and let's say white plays knight bd2. What do we do next? We play cd4. We can start with b6 as well. Never, that's not a problem too. But I prefer cd4, ed4, forcing the hanging pawns. Now this pawn is not really supported by any other pawn, so we have a true case of hanging pawns. And only now playing b6 with the idea of bishop a6 and then putting pressure on these pawns, probably with rook c8. And this is not a comfortable position for white. You can also play bishop b4, improve the bishop and attack the knight on d2 so that the pawn on c4 might be even more vulnerable. Black has a very comfortable game here. And that brings us an end to this sideline with b3. Let's go back and check knight bd2. Tried by some grandmasters with the common idea of playing dc4, knight c4, keeping the space advantage. But in my opinion, it's just not good because you obstruct the bishop on c1. What do? The typical c5. b6 was possible, but I don't like the position after cd5. If we would have been playing knight d5, yes, it's okay. But now the plan with c5 is not so great because dc5, bishop into c5, and well, white can play knight b3, and this bishop is under some pressure. I don't want to allow that, and therefore I just play c5, d into c5. C into d5, as usual, is met with queen into d5. Not e into d5, because I don't want to create an isolated pawn. Queen d5 and short castle. If you play dc5, now I can play queen c5, and white is in some trouble because of the bishop on c1. Short castle, knight c6, developing a piece and preparing e5 next. We'll then get the bishop out, the rook to d8. Maybe the queen can switch to h5 as well if white plays knight b3. We already have a comfortable position. And if white plays short castle, cd4. We win the pawn. Why? Okay, what was the point of short castle? White is ready to sacrifice some material for initiative, but we take it, knight b3. And do we try to retain the pawn somehow, or do we just focus on development? Development. Queen h5. The last move which you need to remember, the point is that after knight d4, we play e5, get the bishop out, then get the knight out, and we are much better due to the extra space and the subsequent activity of our pieces. White's king is not feeling so safe with the bishop coming on h3 and the knight coming to g4, followed by some e4, bishop g2 ideas, targeting the pawn on h2. So this isn't great. And if white plays dc5 on the 7th move, which is the most played move, white's point is that after bishop c5, they may have knight b3 or a3 b4, targeting our bishop. We still play bishop c5, short castle, and what do? Knight c6. So white's idea is to play knight b3. So why are we allowing that? Well, because you have spent some time and this bishop is not yet developed. a3. If white plays knight b3, we just play bishop b6, not to e7, because I want to keep my bishop on the most active diagonal. CD5 and now ED5. Although we have an isolated pawn here, the key difference is now my bishop is very active. I'm putting some pressure on the F2 pawn with ideas of knight e4 in the air. And if white plays something like bishop g5, let's play h6. You want to take? Please take. The queen's targeting the pawn on b2, and so we don't mind the trade of bishops. If this happens on the board, we'll have a slightly better position due to the pair of bishops. The pawn on e2 is weak as well. So white needs to play a3, preparing b4, and we just stop it. a5. C into d5. If white tries to be clever and play queen c2, delaying c d5, now we can gain space with d4 with the typical e5 in our hands, and then we'll have a good position due to development of our pieces and the extra space. So c d5, e into d5 as usual. With the bishop on c5, we are not really afraid of the isolated pawn. What are our ideas? Just to get our pieces on the most active squares. We want to get the bishop to g4, the rook to e8, the rook to c8, onto the most active squares, knight to e4, targeting the pawn on f2. Of course, when this knight moves to b3. If this doesn't happen, then white cannot complete the development on the queen side. Knight b3, bishop b6. And this is a good moment to stop. The typical bishop g4, rook e8, this rook to c8, queen to d7. Just get your pieces in, attack white's weaknesses on e2 and b2 if required, and bishop g5 is always met with h6. And that brings us an end to knight bd2. The last sideline, which we are yet to check, is bishop f4, which I wouldn't have included it, frankly, if Magnus had not played it. If Magnus plays it, it deserves respect. D into c4. So white was trying to stop us from playing e5 in these c5 sidelines, but because white has played bishop g2 and not queen c2, we were quick enough to play dc4. Queen c2. Queen a4 is possible, but after knight d5, queen c4, we transpose to the main line of this subsystem with bishop f4. So dc4, queen c2, knight d5. We are trying to exploit this bishop on f4 and preparing b5 now. We couldn't have played b5 here due to some ideas of a4, and our pawns, we cannot play a6 due to ab5. But because we are happy playing knight d5, targeting this bishop, we can remain consistent with that plan. And now a4 is easily met with c6, where we are not afraid of knight e5. Queen c4, pretty much the only move white has to recover the material. Knight f4. b5 is a very strong alternative, which Jan played, but I don't want you to memorize lines when it's not required. This requires some hefty bit of memorization, so let's not go there. Knight f4, gf4, and white now has some space for a poor pawn structure and development. How do we proceed with it? By playing the very smart knight d7, developing a piece, so neutralizing white's activity by a notch, and playing c5 to neutralize white's space at the same time, right? And once we get c5 in, we'll have a very comfortable position. Just develop your pieces after c5, right? That's the only thing which is required. And that brings us an end to this sideline with bishop f4. We now move on to white's main sideline with queen c2. With queen c2, white is defending the pawn on c4. And white's claim is that after dc4, queen c4, white keeps a small space advantage. The drawback, of course, is that now the pawn on d4 is not protected, which we exploit with c5. Now white has two main moves and a small sideline with cd5. The main line here is d into c5, while white can also try short castle. Let's start with short castle. So white tries to finish their development, but in return has to give up the center after cd4, knight d4. And if we allow white to develop with rook d1 or knight c3, white will have an edge due to the active pieces. I'm sorry. Yeah, the active pieces and somewhat more of space. But after e5, we take away white's space advantage and we are now looking to get our pieces into the game. After e5, the diagonal for the c8 bishop is now open, which we'll exploit somewhat later in the future. White's main move here is knight f5. Of course, knight f3 runs into the typical knight c6. We have gotten our piece, and if we get d4 and e4 in, we'll be better. White probably needs to play cd5, but after knight b4 or knight d5, we have a very comfortable game where we have more space, more pieces in the center, and white might be able to keep the balance, but nothing more. So knight f5. White's looking to win the bishop pair and challenge our pawn on c5. What do? d4. We retain our central space and we say that, hey, if you win the bishop pair, I have space in the space as compensation. White has two moves here, the main one being knight e7 or the other one being finishing the development with bishop g5. This one will transpose to the main line after knight c6, knight d2. We are just looking to develop our pieces. And now white's threat is knight e7 and knight e4. So we just play h6. Of course, white doesn't want to give up the bishop pair to us, where we'll have the pair of bishops as well as the space. So white needs to play knight e7. And after queen e7, we transpose to the main line after bishop f6, queen f6. So what does white do here? Mainly take first. So why knight e7 and not bishop g5? To retain more flexibility. After queen e7, white's main move is bishop g5, but white may also try the cunning b4, gaining space on the queen side and exploiting that queen b4 runs into bishop 8. White has the threat of bishop into f8 next. So let's start with b4. It's not the main line. The main line here is bishop g5, but let's have a look. So we want to play queen b4, but obviously the issue is bishop a3. At the same time, we might want to play e4, gain further space. What is the best way to try to achieve both the goals? Rook d8. We develop a piece, and now we are threatening e4 as well as queen into b4. White has two moves here. One is b5, the other one is c5. Note that moves like a3 are very slow, which we can very comfortably exploit with h6, stopping bishop g5, or in fact, queen c7 as well. We get out of the pen and we want to play this, or maybe play this, bishop to e6, and so on. b5. If white plays c5, by the way, you loosen up the d5 square, which we'll exploit after knight c6. Of course, b5 runs into knight b4, and this pawn is weak. Queen c4 runs into knight b d5. Then we'll play bishop e6. We'll have all sorts of knight jumps in the air. This pawn is weak, which we may exploit with rook a8 as well. Black is already winning here. If not, black has a very big advantage. And if white plays a3, then we play a5, b5, and now these pawns are weak, but we don't want to play a passive move. We want to be attacking, and what do? d3, ed3, knight d4, and we'll win one of these pawns. We have a great knight on d4 in the center, and if we recover one of the pawns, we'll have a very good position due to better pawn structure, more space, and pretty much more active pieces as well. And so white's main move here is b5. This keeps the pawn, stops us from playing knight c6, but weakens the square. How do we exploit that? With knight b d7. We want to play knight c5. bishop e6 and rook a c8, and then try to put pressure on this pawn on c4. Other idea could be to play rook b8, b6, and bishop b7, exchanging of this active bishop for this inactive one, and then again trying to put pressure on c4. Uh, Pretty much that's it for this line. Uh, there is an alternative here after b4, rook d8, b5 to play queen c7 first, putting pressure on this pawn, and then maybe playing knight bd7. I prefer knight bd7 because of the simplicity, but you can have a look there as well. And so let's come back to white's main move with bishop g5. White wants to play knight d2 and knight d4, put pressure on the knight on f6. What do? Firstly, we develop our knight d2, and because knight e4 is threatened, we play h6. White is forced to take since bishop h4 runs into g5, where this bishop is trapped. Bishop f6 and queen f6. Let's take a small pause and try to evaluate the position. We have more space, but white has a very active bishop and slight lead in development too. So what is white's goal? To exploit that lead in development, while our goal is to just finish our development. If we are able to do that, we'll retain a small edge due to the extra space. And that being said, white should be proactive and make active moves like c5. If white plays something like a3, this is very slow and helps us get our last piece in with bishop f5, where we already have an advantage. The queen either needs to come in front of this pawn, thus rendering b4 impossible, or retreat to a passive square, which is very good for us. If white plays knight e4, this keeps the the knight on the active square, but after queen e7, we'll play bishop f5 and solve all of our opening problems. So there is c5, preparing knight c4 and knight d6. What do? Develop our piece. Bishop f5, queen b3. White is looking to put some pressure here, which we can very safely avoid with queen e7. We are also keeping an eye on white's weaknesses, apart from defending the pawn. And the queen was sort of misplaced on f6 because it was not doing anything. White's main move here is knight d4, knight to e4, sorry, with the threat of knight d6. And if white's able to lodge a knight on d6, we'll be in some pressure. So we neutralize that plan with bishop e6. And now our idea is to play bishop d5 and exchange this bishop on g2. Once we have accomplished that, we'll have a very good position, because then knight d6 won't bother us, since there would be no pressure along this diagonal. White is in some trouble due to this pawn on c5. And yeah, that brings us an end to this variation. And white probably has to... So short castle is probably not the most testing line, and white probably has to play dc5 here. By the way, cd5 as usual isn't great because of cd4. d6, bishop e6. We have already checked these kind of positions. Knight c6, knight b4, rook c8. And yeah, we have development advantage. We have more space in the center. Everything's in our favor. And if knight d4, now we play knight d5. Not making an isolated pawn with e d5, since this bishop is not super active. And after knight d4, knight d5, white has some issues due to the lack of development with the knight on d4. If white's king would have been on g1, I mean, if white would have castled, everything would have been fine. But with castling now, we have a small tactical resource with knight b4, threatening queen d4. And after queen c4, e5. We are making threats, forcing white to retreat, after which we'll have a great lead in development and somewhat extra space, meaning we'll have a small edge. White's best bet is a3, but after e d4, a b4, it's clear that black is pushing due to better pawn structure. We might play knight c6, then threaten bishop e6, knight e5, and so on. The pawns are weak. The pawns on queen side are weak, and we are exerting a lot of pressure. That brings us to the main line with d into c5, where white's point was that bishop c5 runs into c into d5. Now here queen a5 is a very good equalizer, but doesn't offer many fighting chances, and so we play d4, gaining space and playing in the most ambitious way possible. Our idea is very simple: knight c6, e5, developing a piece, gaining more space, and then either we would take back with the bishop or play knight d7, knight c5, putting our knight on an active square, and then getting our bishop out with bishop to g4. White's most ambitious bet here is to play b4, defending this pawn. There is short castle, but this doesn't threaten us. We just play knight c6. Starting with bishop c5 was possible too. And white has two critical ideas here. There's bishop g5, trying to create some threats of knight d2, knight e4 after bishop c5. Or there is a3. If white plays bishop g5, we firstly start with e5, gain more space. And after bishop into f6, if white plays knight d2, we get time to get knight d7 in and play the typical knight c5, where the knight would be very well placed. And if bishop f6, we take back with the bishop, and we'll take this pawn whenever we want to, right? It's a pawn which is doubled and cannot be defended easily, while now we have the pair of bishops and the center. a3, preparing b4. Let's stop that. a5. Knight e1. This is the only critical try. If white plays knight d2, we have plenty of options, but bishop e7, preparing bishop c5 seems like the strongest one. With knight a1, white wants to play knight d3 and defend this pawn. At the same time, white's opening up the diagonal for the bishop. What is white's idea? White now wants to play knight d2, knight d3 and develop pieces. We stop that with bishop g4. The point, after knight d3, we play queen e7 with the idea of playing e4. And if white plays knight d2, the point is revealed now that we have bishop into e2. The other idea could be to play bishop f5, take on d3 and take on c5, although the key idea definitely is e4. And so white probably has to play a3 here, but we'll just play a5 and have the typical e5 bishop into c5 plan, followed by bishop g4 and then trying to gain more space in the center. So white probably has to play b4 here, gaining more space and stopping bishop into c5. We obviously undermine the pawn with a5, and white has to play b5. Now this weakens the pawn on c5 and gives us a great outpost, but also stops us from playing knight c6, where our knight would have been ideally placed. We have to take back the pawn, and white's main idea here is to play knight d2 with the idea of playing knight b3 and putting pressure on this pawn on d4. What do? We want to play e5 and we want to be prophylactic against knight b3, knight c5. And thus we play knight d7, develop a piece and prepare e5. Knight b3. Do we play a retreating move? No, we can't do that because of the loose pawn on d4. So what do? e5. Gaining more space and asking white to take the bishop on c5 and then take on e5, where white will waste a lot of time. Short castle is the main move. This was played between the only OTB game at the time of making the file between Daniel Dubov and Wesley So. If white plays knight c5, probably white should castle here, because knight into e5 is too hasty, and after rook e8, white is under some trouble. There is a lot of pressure on the e file. Knight f3 is not possible due to d3, and the pin is very strong, while knight d3 runs into bishop g4, getting a new piece out, attacking white's weakness. If white plays f3, this stops the threats on the e2 square, but now this bishop is dead, and after bishop f5, we have several weaknesses to attack to. there are some tactical motives of rook e2 and bishop d3 in the air, let's say after short castle. Or we might even play short castle knight f d7 with the idea of knight e5, maybe rook e2, and just put pressure on those pawns on e2 and c4 along with the knight on d3. White's pieces are just way too passive and incorrectly placed. So white probably has to play short castle here. And we play rook e8. Our idea is absolutely straightforward. We want to play e4 at some point, and at the same time we defend the e5 pawn against the threat of knight c5, and knight e5. White has two choices here. One is to play a4, which stops us from playing a4 and provoking knight c5, after which this bishop gets opened up. So knight into c5, knight into c5 is a very good trade for us. And the other one is to play knight c5 directly. This is more direct, while this is more positional. White's idea is now to play knight e1, improve the piece further with knight d3. Now, since we are not able to play knight c5, how do we develop this bishop? Probably through this route, but then the bishop on g2 is dominating, right? We can't play b6 due to the discovery threats. And because of that, the move rook a7 comes to the mind. Rook b8 was similar to, but then this pawn was weak in some lines, which I didn't want to give white access to, and thus we play rook a7. Rook fd1 is the main move with the idea of playing knight c5, and e3. If white plays knight e1, we just play b6. Now this bishop is a stronghold, and after knight d3, we can in fact gain more space with e4. Knight c5, takes, and just look at our pawns in the center. We'll probably blockade this pawn and then play bishop f5 and start steamrolling those pawns, right? So white has probably rook d1, and there is knight fd2, stopping us from playing e4, but we can still play b6, get the bishop out. If white plays knight c5, we have great compensation, and our idea is very simple. Bishop b5, eliminate white's advantage of bishop pair, and then try to push e4. White probably plays rook d1, and we still play b6. e3, the most critical try. The point is takes, runs into knight c5. We can't take knight c5 due to the queen on d8. But what do we do? By the way, d5, knight c5, ef2, winning a pawn might seem clever, but after queen f2, bc5, and knight h4, it is in fact white who is better, even though white is a pawn down because of the passed pawn, active pieces, and the pair of bishops. In an open position, those pieces and passed pawn is much stronger than the single extra pawn. So we can't allow that, and thus we play d3, exploit the poor positioning of white's pieces. Queen into d3, e4 wins a piece, while after rook d3, e4, white has some compensation after rook d7, but we are still very much into the game after bishop d7. And if white doesn't take on d3, we'll just cement the pawn on d3 with e4, where we are just outrightly winning due to the passed pawn right into the heart of white's position. And so this a4 is not a problem, since we can just play rook a7 and finish our development with b6, bb7. As usual, I'll repeat it again. In openings, if you have some static advantage, let's say space or pawn structure, and if you're able to get all of your pieces into the game, you will have no problems whatsoever. So rook e8, knight c5, knight into c5, and now we are threatening to get our bishop out into the game. So why did white play knight into c5? Well, because of bishop a3. White is very direct and is creating some threats against our knight. We just play queen c7, and if given one move, we just want to play this and b6. If we get that, we'll have a very good dream position. And so white's only try to stop that is by playing rook a b1 with the idea of playing b6 followed by rook b5. And if white can play rook b5, we'll have to move our knight where things get a bit tricky. So we can't stop b6 comfortably. If not, what do? We can stop rook b5. At the same time, I don't want to be just passive. I want to get my pieces into the game. So the best move here is bishop d7, stopping bishop rook b5 after b6, and at the same time developing a piece. As usual, if we get this in, we have a great hold of the center, and once we are able to consolidate, we'll have a much better position, and then we'll try to start rolling our pawns in the center. The rest of the game is not theoretically relevant, but you'll find further analysis in this position in the model game section. This was a game between Daniel Dubois and Wesley So. All right, so this brings us an end to the chapter on the sidelines from White and Catalan, and let's just sum it up. So after g3, okay, let's start from move 3. If White plays g3, we are not bothered with the move order subtlety, and we can play knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, and transpose to the main lines. After knight f3, knight f6, g3, bishop e7, White has some sidelines, queen c2, queen b3, bishop f4, and maybe queen d3 here. White can start from queen d3 as well. Let's say queen c2, castle. We want to play c5. If White plays bishop f4, we still play c5, dc5, d4, followed by knight c6, knight d7, and e5. If White plays knight bd2, c5, dc5, knight c6, followed by d4 and e5, the typical way to gain more space. If White tries to play queen b3, castle bishop g2, trying to be clever against c5 ideas, we'll still play c5, cd5, and now we won't play ed5 and spoil our pawn structure, but play queen d5, followed by knight c6, queen b3, and a very comfortable position. If White plays bishop f4, castle, queen c2, we have checked this, sorry. We have checked c5 here with the idea of knight c6, d4 and knight d7, followed by e5. And if White plays bishop g2, castle, if White plays queen d3, the queen is exploited here with b6, followed by bishop a6, c5, knight c6, and the typical strategy to undermine White's center. If White plays b3, we play dc, bc, c5, make those pawns weak, and then attack it with knight c6, knight a5, probably b6, bishop a6, or just play queen c7, bd7, and get those pieces into the game. If White plays knight d2, we just play c5, undermine White's center. And so White probably needs to play queen c2. We play c5, dc5. If short castle, cd, knight d, e5, knight f5, d4. We have great pawns in the center, and all we are looking to do is just develop. Note that after takes bishop g5, we play, knight c6, knight d2 and h6, and rid of the bishops. After this, we just want to get our bishop into the game, where we'll be better due to the more space. And if White plays b4, we play rook d8, getting out of the pin. And after b5, knight d7, we just want to get the pieces in with knight c5, bishop e6, or rook b8, b6, bishop b7, and chop off this active bishop on g2. So that brings us an end to short castle. And if dc5, the typical d4, preparing knight c6 and e5. b4, if White plays castle, we just play knight c6. We want to play e5, and a3 is met with a5. b4, a5, b5, bishop c5 with the idea of knight d7 and e5. And if we are able to develop our pieces, we'll be better due to the more space. Knight b3, e5. Okay, takes knight e5 is not great because of rook e8 and great initiative. While castle runs into rook e8. And again, we want to play queen c7, maybe rook b8 or rook a7 and b6, and just get our knight on c5 and get all of our pieces into the game. All right, so that brings us an end to the chapter. I hope you were able to get the key ideas of the position. You don't have to memorize everything. Just remember the key plans. And I'll see you into the last segment of Catalan sidelines, starting with d4, d4, d5, nf3, nf6, g3, where white is trying to delay c4.